Today, we're going to dive into one of the most important books on military strategy ever written. And we're doing it with this companion to the work of a man who totally changed how we think about war, Carl von Clausewitz.
And that brings up a really fascinating question, doesn't it? In our age of drones and cyber warfare, why are the most powerful people in the world still poring over the writings of a Prussian soldier who's been dead for almost 200 years?
Well, to get the answer, we got to start with the man himself. This is Carl von Clausewitz, who's often called the philosopher of war.
Now, one look at this timeline, you can see that Clausewitz wasn't some academic living in an ivory tower. No way. This guy was a soldier, forged in the absolute inferno of the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, he saw combat as a kid and even witnessed Napoleon's disastrous retreat from Moscow. His philosophy wasn't born in a library. It was born from brutal first-hand experience.
And his experience was just off the charts. He was an aide to princes, a close friend to military reformers. He was even embedded with the Russian general staff. He himself said he was continually behind the scenes, which gave him this incredible bird's-eye view of how politics and military action are all tangled together. You see, his goal was never to write a simple rulebook for war. He wanted to teach leaders a whole new way to think about it.
And that whole new way of thinking, it really boils down to one single, totally game-changing idea.
Okay, this right here, this one sentence, is the absolute core of his entire philosophy. For Clausewitz, war isn't what happens when politics breaks down. War is politics. It's just a rational tool that a state uses to get what it wants, but using different means.
And it's so important to get this distinction he's making. The means of war, sure, they're violent. He called it a duel on a vast scale. But the object, the reason for it all, is always political. You're trying to make the other guy submit to your will. The actual fighting is just the tool you use to get there.
He put it just like this: the political goal has to drive every single thing you do on the battlefield. The moment you separate the two, war just becomes pointless, brutal violence.
But here's the thing. Clausewitz was no armchair general. He was a realist. He knew that even the most brilliant plans slam headfirst into the pure chaos of a real battlefield. And he had a name for this reality check: friction.
This might be his second most famous quote, and man, it just perfectly captures the idea of friction. A plan can look absolutely perfect on a map, but in the real world, it can completely fall apart. So why does that happen?
Well, it's because of all the messy, unpredictable stuff. It's human nature and pure chance. Danger makes people hesitate. Exhaustion grinds you down. Your information is almost always bad. He famously said most reports are false. And then there's just plain old bad luck, the sudden fog, the unexpected storm. All of that stuff is friction.
So you can think of friction as this invisible force that every general has to push against. It's the huge gap between a clean, simple war on paper and the bloody, confusing, chaotic reality on the ground.
But Clausewitz saw something else happening during his lifetime too. A massive change in how wars were fought. A shift that would make conflict way more total and destructive than anything the world had ever seen.
You see, before the French Revolution, you had what were called cabinet wars. These were pretty limited fights between kings and their small professional armies. But then the revolution happened, and bam, everything changes. War suddenly becomes an affair of the people. The entire nation gets mobilized, unleashing this terrifying new kind of absolute war that Napoleon would go on to perfect.
And this is the really critical takeaway, right? The moment the entire nation gets involved, all the old limits on violence and effort they go out the window. War becomes a total struggle for survival, fought with every single resource a country can possibly find. So this new, unlimited kind of war brings up a huge question. How do you know when you've won? How do you know when to stop? Well, Clausewitz had a really powerful way of thinking about this, about knowing your goals, and more importantly, knowing your limits. He basically broke it down into three main objectives. First, you got to beat their army. Second, you take their stuff, their cities, their supplies. And third, and this is an incredibly modern idea, you have to win over public opinion. He knew that breaking the enemy's will to fight was just as important as winning battles.
But, and this is brilliant, he also warned about a hidden danger in winning. He called it the culminating point. It's that exact moment when your attack has been so successful and you're so stretched out that you actually become weak and vulnerable. Just think about Napoleon marching into Moscow. He won every battle to get there, but in doing so, he blew right past his culminating point and walked straight into a catastrophe.
This idea of a culminating point basically splits all wars into two big categories: If you're not strong enough to completely crush your enemy, you have to fight a war for a limited goal, like just taking one province. But if you do have that overwhelming strength, then you can aim for their total overthrow. For Clausewitz, the true genius of a leader is knowing exactly which kind of war you're in.
So let's bring it all home. Why do these 200-year-old ideas still matter so much? Why are they so essential for understanding the world we live in right now?
Well, his influence is honestly everywhere. The general who unified Germany, Moltke, was his student. The guy who trained the Japanese military staff before their incredible victory over Russia in 1905, he taught Clausewitz's principles. And get this, after Japan won, their top Marshal sent a telegram to his old teacher that basically said, "We hope you're proud of your pupils." Wow.
In fact, it was so obvious that the military correspondent for the Times covering that war literally headlined his analysis, "Clausewitz in Manchuria." He saw it with his own eyes. The Japanese won because they followed the doctrine, and the Russians lost because they ignored it. This shows you his work isn't just some abstract philosophy. It has real, world-changing consequences.
And that all leads to a pretty sobering final thought from our guide here. It argues that we have to look at modern geopolitics through this lens, that leaders see war not as a failure of policy, but as just another tool of policy, a tool they can use to impose their will on others. Which leaves us with a final massive question. If Clausewitz is right, and war is really just politics with other means, then what does that force us to truly understand about the nature of politics itself? Thanks for joining us for this explainer.